What's going on, my good people? Mike Hidalgo here. Thank you for joining us on another FCP Euro DIY. Today we're working on a 2011 Porsche 911S. Today in the 911 behind me, we're going to be covering how to do the front end control arm replacement. Now this is going to be applicable to your 997.1 and .2 vehicles. We recommend you do it every 40 to 60,000 miles. Typically, it's all really going to depend on what kind of terrain the car sees and what kind of driving you do. Obviously, if you track the car, it's going to be a little bit sooner than later. Today, we're using our Mila kit. This comes with both arms for the forwards and the rearwards for the front. And typically, you're going to want to replace these every 40 to 60,000 miles. This car is nearing the 64,000 mile mark, so it's definitely due. A couple things to look out for when you are looking to do control arms. Typically, the rubber bushings tend to crack and fail over time. These coffin arms are notorious for having failed bushings. The sleeves kind of separate from the rubber bushing themselves. And a couple other things that will cause a control arm replacement need is bad alignment. Sometimes the bushings get so bad that no matter how many times you try to align it, the car will never be in spec. So another thing to look out for when doing this job is, depending on where the vehicle is located, the car, for example, behind us is a New England car. So oftentimes with original hardware, you have two different metals that tend to fuse together over time due to salt, grime on the road, whatever you may call it. So just be mindful when you're getting into this job that seized hardware is a thing. No matter what kind of car it is, whether it's a 911, a BMW, Audi, Volkswagen, doesn't matter. If you've seen our Audi A4 control arm video, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But before we get too carried along, let's take a look at some of the tools we're going to need for this DIY. For this job, we're going to be using two different size torque wrenches. We have a 1/2 inch and a 3/8 drive. We have an 18mm crow's foot. A paint pen always comes in handy when you're torquing down things. We have two different 18mm wrenches, two different 21mm wrenches, as well as a 16mm wrench. Pry bar always comes in handy. A hammer. Some nice to haves are electric tools just to speed everything up and really get the big bolts off and quick. Sockets, we have a 19, a 21, different size 18s, as well as two different size 16s, a 10mm for some of the hardware on the splash shield, and a T25 as well. We also are going to be using this CTA ball joint popper. This is tool 4013, so that comes in handy. If you don't have one of those, a regular pickle fork will work as well. Now that we know what tools we're going to be using on this job, let's go ahead and get started. All right, my good people, we are at the car. We're going to start by removing our wheel. We're working on the passenger side today. However, both driver and passenger side process is identical, so you'll see us do the front right. Grab a 19mm socket to get our 5 lug bolts off. Wonderful. Now with that off, I'm going to go ahead and raise the car a little bit more. If you're working at home, you're just going to want to get underneath it. We're going to go ahead and drop our splash shield so we can access all our control arm hardware. Now we're underneath the 911. We're going to go ahead and start by removing our T25 hardware that holds the splash shield on. There should be about 11 of them, so let's go ahead and zap that off. And then at the very end, you'll see me switch tools. We're actually going to grab a 10mm socket out of the toolbox to remove a couple plastic 10mm nuts that join the two shields in the middle. We'll need to drop that a little bit. All right, let's take this off and set it to the side. While I have you under here, we're going to go ahead and loosen up these two 16mm bolts. One is part of the subframe, and the other one actually holds our forward control arm. This one we're going to pull it out all the way. The subframe one, we're just going to loosen it up. It'll allow it to drop a little bit and help us wiggle that arm out of there when we get to that point. It's using a 16mm socket that I grabbed out of the toolbox last minute on the gun. And then for the control arm bolt, we're going to need an 18. Got my 18mm socket for the control arm bolt. So I'm just going to pull through all the way. From there, we're going to work on removing the front bolt that holds this forward control arm on. Next on the list is this 21mm nut and 18mm head. I'm going to grab a 21mm wrench, and I stole the same 18mm socket just to speed things up, but you can use a ratchet as well with a normal socket on there or a regular 18mm wrench. So again, 21 on top, 18 on the gun just to speed it up. And that'll come right through. From there, we should be able to pull this arm out, so let's go ahead and work on that. You also have this brake shield, which I'll show you in a moment, that just clips on the top half of the tie rod that comes out with this forward arm. Here you go. You have a small clip right here that you undo, and you'll be able to clear the tie rod. Let's set this off to the side and work on getting the coffin arm off. Next, we're going to work on the wheel carrier end. We have an 18mm nut on top of the other side of our ball joint. So I'm going to grab a wrench and try to break that free. Sometimes what you can do is if the tapered end starts to spin on you with the nut, you can take either a floor jack if you're working on the ground or a screw jack if you're working on the lift, and you can apply pressure to the bottom of the ball joint on the opposite end so that it kind of locks it into the wheel carrier side, preventing the ball joint from spinning. Now we have our 18mm nut off. I'm going to go ahead and try to use the CTA ball joint popper tool. Basically what I did is I just shoved the key in the ignition so that it would unlock the steering column. You don't have to turn the key, you just put it in. Then I turned it full lock to the right. I'm working on the passenger side. If you're working on the driver's side, you want to turn it full lock to the left. And the idea is that I have some access to feed this CTA tool in between the ball joint and the wheel carrier. Something like that. Never hurts to have a hammer just to give it a couple love taps into place. Something like that. And then if you are using the CTA tool, you're going to need a 24mm socket or wrench. I had a socket in the toolbox that I grabbed. I'm going to put it on the impact. Should be able to pop it right off. With that popped, that should allow us to pull it out. Beautiful. Now we have our ball joint free. We're going to go ahead and remove our nut and bolt combo on the subframe side of things. You're going to need a 16mm wrench or socket for the bolt head and 18mm for the nut side. So I'm going to take a long 16 and I'm going to counter hold with a regular 18. Once I get it started, I should be able to hit it with the ratcheting side of my wrench. Now we have our nut and bolt off, we can go ahead and pull our arm out. Starting on the ball joint end. Let's go ahead and get our new arm situated and we'll start reinstalling our new parts. We have our new Mila arm. We're gonna go ahead and install it. Nice fresh boot around the ball joint. You love to see it. Starting by the subframe side, we're gonna go ahead and place it in. Just like so. I'm pulling up on the wheel carrier with my hand just so it's out of my way and I can get my bolt started. With that started, I'm going to go ahead and just hand feed my nut on the other side. Again, that's an 18mm nut, 16mm bolt head. I'm also going to go ahead and get the ball joint end fed through the wheel carrier while everything's nice and loose. And start the new 18mm nut up top. Sweet. Now, at this point, it's very important that whenever you're doing control arms with bushings similar to the ones on these coffin arms, you want to make sure that you're tightening them down at ride height. If I were to, granted this car's on coilovers, so the droop isn't as dramatic as it would be on a stock car. If I were to tighten the bolts down the way they are now and then set the car on the ground, I can risk tearing the bushings, they can wear prematurely, and they can also give you a bit of a bouncy ride. So let me grab a screw jack. If you're following along at home, you can use a floor jack to simulate what we're about to do. Be right back. We have our screw jack positioned under the control arm. I'm going to go ahead and raise it. It's not going to take too much on this car. Again, because it is on coilovers, the droop is very minimal. The idea is that you're setting the suspension to what it would be like when the car is on the ground under load. Another way you can do this is by measuring the distance of the center of the hub to the fender line when the car is on the ground. That's going to do us right there. Now we're going to go ahead and snug these down. And again, we're using an 18mm wrench on the nut end and a 16mm wrench on the bolt head end. We have our 16mm head bolt. I went ahead and upgraded to an electric ratchet just to zap in that 18mm nut a little quicker. With that snugged up, I'm going to use my wrenches to really snug them up. And with that snugged up pretty good by hand, we're going to go ahead and torque them with a torque wrench. We're going to torque them down to 89 foot-pounds. Beautiful. I always like to put a little paint mark on things whenever they're torqued down, just so that I know if they come loose by chance. And with that done, we can go ahead and tighten up our 18mm nut on top of our ball joint. And we're going to keep the screw jack on here so that it keeps pressure on the tapered end and hopefully it does not spin on us while we lock it on. And again, this is an 18mm nut. Just using a ratcheting wrench. Once that's snug up, if you have a crow's foot, you can go ahead and torque it down to 56 foot-pounds, similar to what the ball joint ends are on the tie rods. I love it. And just as we did on the inside of our hardware, on the subframe side, we'll go ahead and mark this one as well. Now we can go ahead and get rid of the screw jack and prep our forward control arm so that we can go ahead and get one step closer to wrapping up this job. All right, my good people, we have our old arm, we have our new one. Before we install the new forward, we have to swap over this brake duct, brake shield, airflow, you call it whatever you want. But we're gonna do this with a flathead screwdriver. You can use a small pick as well. And the idea is that you're gonna open up the two tabs here and separate these. And you'll see on the arms you have these small notches. These are where the plastic tabs found on the inside of these shields are gonna key in, just to A, tell you that they're in the right position, and B, keep it so that when you put it back together, your tie rod can still go through this little opening. So let's get rid of this old arm and get our new one ready for install. Once you get one side started, get your tabs over, and you can fold the other side over as well. Make sure you get these two little tabs on the inside as well. There's one. And there's two. Everything looks good. Now we can go ahead and install this in our car. All right, my good people, we got our arm ready to rock and roll. We're gonna go ahead and feed it into the subframe side first. And we're also gonna feed it over our forward control arm as well. Now that we have it kind of situated in place, we're gonna go ahead and start our 18/21mm combo bolt on the coffin arm side of things. Now we're gonna feed from the bottom right here. Feed our 18 head bolt through the bottom, 21mm nut on the top. Just get that started by hand. Now we're gonna go ahead and get underneath the vehicle and work on installing the hardware on the subframe side of things. All right, we have our forward control arm. Went ahead and pulled out a small pry bar just to kind of help with aligning the holes here for the control arm. We have an 18mm socket and just get it started. And we're also gonna go ahead and snug up our 16 really quick. That 16mm bolt, we're gonna go ahead and torque to 74 foot-pounds. We're gonna go ahead and mark it. And then we're gonna grab an 18mm socket and torque that down to 118 foot-pounds. Sweet. I'm gonna go ahead and mark that as well. And now all that's left is this 18/21mm combo. I'm gonna grab a 21mm wrench and the electric ratchet and just snug this up quickly. And now we're gonna go ahead and torque this down to 118 foot-pounds. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna leave the 21mm wrench up top. I'm gonna grab a small towel so that when my wrench bottoms out on the caliper, it doesn't mar it. And then we can go ahead and torque it down. All right, we got our towel set up, our 21mm wrench up top, and our 18 on our torque wrench. And you already know the drill, my good people. Let's mark that bad girl. And there we have it. We have our control arms torqued up. We have our control arms buttoned up and torqued down. We're gonna go ahead and put the belly pan while we have it up at this height, and we'll get closer to wrapping up this DIY. All right, we're gonna go ahead and start by feeding in the back end of the tray over here. And from there, you can shove the two far ends underneath your bumper cowling just to kind of hold everything up in place while you grab your hardware. So it should look something like that. I'm gonna start with my 10mm plastic nuts. And now from there, we can grab our T25 and install our 11 bolts. Now all we have left to do is put on our wheel. All right, my good people, we made it this far. We're gonna go ahead and put our wheel back on. Again, these are 5 19mm lug bolts. Now we're gonna go ahead and drop the car down and torque our lug bolts. We're gonna go ahead and torque these down to 90 foot-pounds. All right, my good people, there we have it, another DIY in the books. Overall, a pretty straightforward on the 997. This is going to be applicable to your .1 and .2 models. And again, today we worked on the passenger side of the vehicle. However, the driver's side is going to be identical. If you like this DIY, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments on what we did today, leave them in the comment box below. And if you like this DIY and you want to see more like them, please consider subscribing. We make new ones all the time. As always, thank you for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.